season two, um, there was a lot of struggle and a lot of trial, but season two is the real reason why I was so excited to talk to you. You're one of the first people I wanted to speak to because I think that your experience with the show and the things that we were able to learn about you, but about being a human, is one of the most amazing things ever to come out of Alone. And obviously, for you and others, I'm just referencing towards the end of your stay on Vancouver when you kind of had your breakdown moment, and it seemed like to me at least that from that point you weren't really fighting so much as you were living. Can you talk about that and what that was like, and maybe how those moments have continue to shape you today?
Well, I gave up after that point. So I had a really bad day on day 55. I The fish were turning off. I wasn't eating much. Uh, I mean, I was still eating. Thank goodness, there were chanterelle mushrooms everywhere, but I was still eating. But I was crazy hungry, and at that day 55, the best way I can describe it is when I was a kid, I had like 104 temperature one time. And I just remember my head, the only way I can describe it is it just goes zoom, zoom, zoom. So there's just this thing going inside my head. It's like a headache, but only it's just this vibration almost that's going through my head. And the surf is pounding like crazy, which normally I enjoy, but I mean, sometimes I just enjoy just silence, right? So it was really, really bad. I was super, super hungry. Uh, my head was going nuts. Every time I tried to sleep, so th- this had been leading up to this point, but when you're that hungry, you dwell on food. And I was dreaming about food. I would like start to dream about, like when I come home and visiting with my wife, but then immediately it would be, well, what are we going to have for dinner that night? And are we going to go to the grocery store? And blah, 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 blah. And I would wake up about every hour, and I was using a sweater, a wool pullover type thing for a pillow. And I would have drool all over my pillow. And this went on like in Vancouver Island, I was sleeping a lot. As soon as got dark, I'd go to bed and I wouldn't wake up until it was well light. So that was probably at least 14 hours of sleep inside my shelter, or at least staying inside my shelter. And so for like 14 hours, my head was doing that. The surf was pounding. My stomach was hurting, just all this stuff. And I literally, almost like what you see in the movies where, the guy actor slaps the woman when she's freaking out. I slapped myself. And I'm like, dude, I thought I was going insane. I literally thought I was going to, I didn't fear dying. I feared going insane. So I thought I was going to go insane. And luckily, it started to rain, just pitter patter a little bit. And if you've ever spent any time on a tarp, under a tarp during the rain, it makes a certain sound. And for me, that's a very comforting sound. So it comforted me, and I was able to get through the night. And I woke up, got out of bed kind of early, and decided that I would. So I've been one of the items, or you can take two items of emergency rations, and I had not eaten any of my emergency rations because it was only season two, and I was really hard on myself, and I figured that if you eat your emergency rations, it was like cheating. And so, after I'd had that horrible night, I figured I need to eat my emergency rations. And the fish weren't biting. There's so much work involved in an ocean, trying to set trot lines or gill net or whatever. I mean, it was brutal work. And I just kind of gave up. And I'm like, you know what? I'll survive on my emergency rations for as long as I can. And then I'll give up. And I was able to last another, we didn't have that much emergency rations. I mean, like when leading up to day 55, when the fish had turned off, after day 55, what I would do is if I caught a fish, I would eat it. And if I didn't catch a fish, then I would take some beef jerky, just barely a handful, just barely enough to put in one palm. And I would put about a quart and a half of water, maybe 2 quarts of water, and I would boil that for quite some time. And then I would drink the broth. So I'd had about a quart and a half, maybe a quart of jerky broth. And that was my dinner or that was the only meal I would eat for that entire day. And then the next day, I would fill it back up with water again. And then I would drink the broth and then eat the meat. And then by the third day, I usually had something that I had harvested, whether that be a fish or a mushroom or whatever, because by that time, I had to be very careful of how many shellfish I harvested, because I had harvested every single shellfish that was edible off of my little horseshoe cove. So all that was leading. So day 55, I kind of broke and decided to go ahead and eat a little bit more jerky, like actually even not just the broth, but actually eat a tiny little handful of jerky. And I actually started gaining weight off of a tiny handful of jerky a day instead of just eating the broth. And then by day 64 or whatever, I couldn't handle it anymore. I was like, I'm done. I got to eat something. And so, I mean, I gave up on, I mean, I wasn't going to leave if I still had food. But once I started rationing it and I could see the end in sight, that's when I broke down and started crying like crazy. And it's still very painful to this day.
Thinking about that experience.
Yeah. Thinking about that I had to give up. It's a hopelessness. When you don't have food, it's a hopelessness feeling. It's a hopeless feeling. And there's a lot of people on Facebook and stuff that say, why are these people not eating like they give Dave Nessia crap a lot. Mm-hmm. And Dave Nessia is one of the toughest competitors and the nicest guys ever. And they're like, well, he had all that fish and yet he was starving to death. So they have us all talk to a psychologist before we go in and after we're done. And this psychologist has worked with other survival type shows. So she knows the psyche of a person who is starving. And if you go back even and look about, the concentration camps or whatever, not to even, equate
right.
the two.
Yep.
But they always hoarded food, and we always hoarded food. In every survival show, if you're really truly surviving, you hoard food because you know what it's like to not be without food, and to just that mental aspect of knowing that you have at least a bite or a morsel of food. We're not, I mean, when you say dinner, when I say dinner, you're talking like a little bit of flavored water, but that's better than not having anything. And that's for your psyche. That's good to know that you have that. And then once I realized I wasn't going to have any backup, the fish weren't biting. I didn't know how to, I tried all different fishing techniques, but if the fish aren't biting, they're not biting. And once that, I killed all the mice on my place. That was Vancouver Island was Mongolia. I still had mice, that I could have probably trapped, but Vancouver Island, I harvested everything around my area, everything. And that's a hopeless feeling.